Mafia boss caught thug tear the manager's cloth, unaware she was his wife. What he did next left everyone stunned. The diner was supposed to be quiet that morning, but the peace shattered in an instant when the thug grabbed the manager by the collar and tore open the front of her uniform. The exact moment he yanked her cloth and exposed her bra strap, yelling in her face, humiliating her in front of the stunned customers. He had no idea who she really was. He had no idea the woman he was manhandling was the wife of the most feared mafia boss in the entire district. And worst of all, he had no idea that the tall, silent, cold-eyed man standing by the entrance, watching every second of the humiliation without blinking, was her husband. Before we go deeper, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is over there right now. Make sure you subscribe because what's about to happen next will blow your mind completely. This is just the ignition point. The moment the thug's fingers dug into her uniform again, the entire diner froze. Her breath hitched in fear, her hands trembling as she tried to pull away, her voice cracking while she whispered for him to stop. But he didn't stop. He shoved her again, dragging her closer like she was nothing more than a toy he could intimidate for fun. The customers shrank back in their seats, too terrified to interfere, too afraid to even breathe loud. The man behind the thug, the huge tattooed figure with a blank expression, watched like this was just another day of work. The thug said harsh things, leaned in close, made her flinch again, made her shake, made her eyes fill with panic. She just wanted to finish her shift. She had no idea danger was coming in the form of one man, and death was coming in the form of another. But the danger she expected wasn't the real monster in the room. Because her husband, the mafia boss feared in 3 cities, the ghost whose name rivals whispered only at night, was standing right behind her attacker, silent, unmoving, and growing colder by the second. He had come to the diner that morning only to surprise her with lunch. He wanted to see her smile, maybe steal a kiss from her in the storage room like he always did. He wasn't expecting to walk in and witness another man tearing her uniform, grabbing her chest area, humiliating her while she fought back tears. He wasn't expecting to see her shaken, exposed, terrified. He wasn't expecting to see her try to protect herself while the thug barked threats and acted like he owned the place. He wasn't expecting this, but he was built for moments exactly like this. He didn't move at first because he was watching to make sure she wasn't hurt beyond the emotional blow, to make sure she wasn't unconscious, to make sure the bastard didn't cross the final line. But the second the thug lifted his hand again, ready to yank the rest of her uniform harder, her husband stepped forward. No sound, no warning, no words, just step. And the air shifted like a storm had walked into the diner. The thug didn't even notice until a shadow covered him. He turned, annoyed, ready to threaten whoever it was. Then he froze, because standing directly behind him was a man whose presence could crack bones. A man whose stare alone felt like a hand closing around your throat. A man who did not breathe fast, blink fast, or move fast, because real monsters don't rush. They calculate. The thug opened his mouth to talk, but nothing came out because the mafia boss was already grabbing him by the throat with a grip so tight the thug's eyes went wide instantly. The room erupted in gasps. The tattooed man behind them instinctively reached for his gun, but the mafia boss shoved the thug into a table so hard the wood cracked beneath the impact, then snapped his gaze toward the tattooed man with a look that said, "Touch the weapon, and your soul leaves your body." The tattooed man froze. Smart choice, but freezing didn't save him, because the mafia boss was done with warnings. He released the thug just long enough for the man to fall to his knees, coughing and gasping for air, then placed one foot on the thug's chest and pushed him flat onto the floor like he was stepping on trash. He leaned down, eyes darker than hell itself, and whispered something the entire diner could feel even without hearing the words. "You touched my wife." That was all it took. The thug's face drained of color. His hands trembled. He tried to explain, tried to say he didn't know, tried to apologize, but apologies meant nothing in the world he had just stepped into. Her husband didn't shout. He didn't rant. He didn't need to. His silence alone was lethal. He grabbed the thug by the back of the neck and dragged him across the diner floor like dead weight. Customers pushed their chairs back, clearing the path without being asked. No one made eye contact. No one dared breathe too loud. They all knew better. The wife, still shaking, held her torn uniform closed with her hands. Her breathing was uneven, her eyes red from forming tears she hadn't even released. She tried to speak, tried to call out to her husband, but her voice cracked under the weight of the moment. He didn't look back at her yet. He wasn't done. He dragged the thug outside and threw him against the hood of the car so hard the metal dented inward. The tattooed man tried to step forward in defense of his partner, but the Mafia boss cracked him across the face with one punch that sent him sprawling onto the pavement before the man could even finish his first step. One punch. One. And the tattooed man hit the ground unconscious. The thug tried to get up again, tried to run, but the Mafia boss grabbed him by the collar and slammed him back down. Then he bent close enough that the thug could feel every breath of the rage pouring off him. You tore my wife's cloth. You scared her. You touched her. And now you belong to me. The thug whimpered like a child. The customers inside watched from behind the windows, frozen in shock. The entire diner seemed suspended in silence as the Mafia boss stood over the man who had dared lay a hand on his wife. He wasn't going to kill him. Not here, not yet. That would be too easy. Instead, he tossed the thug into the back of his own car like a bag of trash. He looked down at him one last time, his voice low enough to shake the thug's bones. You made a mistake that will cost everyone you work for. That was the real message. He didn't just want revenge. He wanted war. He walked back into the diner, his breathing steady, his expression unreadable. His wife was still clutching her torn uniform, trembling as he approached. She whispered his name in a soft, broken voice. The second he reached her, his entire expression changed. He cupped her face gently, wiped the trembling from her lips with his thumb, looked at her like she was the only person in the world who could calm him. He removed his jacket slowly and wrapped it around her shoulders, covering the torn uniform, shielding her from the eyes watching. Then he kissed her forehead, a soft, slow kiss, the kind of kiss that said, I'm here. I've got you. You're safe. But behind that softness was something else. Rage, calculation, vengeance. Because the moment her tears touched his fingers, something inside him snapped. Something deeper than anger. Something older than mercy. Something that didn't want apologies or explanations. It wanted blood. He led her carefully toward the exit, holding her gently, his hands steady on her back. Every customer watched silently as they passed, too afraid to speak, too intimidated to look away. He helped her into his car with the tenderness of a man who loved her beyond reason. Then he closed the door gently, and when he turned around, all tenderness died instantly. His face went cold, his jaw flexed, his eyes sharpened into something lethal. Because now that someone had dared to humiliate his wife, to touch her, to tear her clothes, to make her tremble, he wasn't stopping at punishing the thug. He wasn't stopping at the tattooed man. He was going for the entire network behind them. He was about to wipe every rival off the map. Tonight, tomorrow, and every night until the last one begged for mercy. The war had officially started. The moment the car door slammed shut, a storm seemed to follow him. His eyes, dark and sharpened like knives, scanned the street, measuring every shadow, calculating every movement. His hands didn't tremble. His breath didn't hitch. He was calm, precise, and lethal. Every instinct in him screamed that what had happened inside the diner was only the beginning. That the humiliation of his wife, the audacity of a man to lay hands on her, wasn't just an offense. It was a declaration of war. And he would respond not just with fury, but with systematic obliteration. Inside the car, she stayed silent, clutching the jacket wrapped around her shoulders as if it were armor. Her body still trembled, every nerve frayed, every heartbeat pounding in a chaotic rhythm. She couldn't understand how someone could exist who embodied both tenderness and terror in equal measure. One moment, he could cradle her, steady her trembling fingers, whisper that she was safe. The next, he could turn the world into ashes for anyone who dared touch her, leaving a trail of shattered bodies and ruined plans. He didn't speak. Words were unnecessary. His grip on the wheel was firm, deliberate, and she felt the aura of his control suffuse the small space. Every turn, every stop, every red light was measured as though he were already planning what would happen to every thug in the district. She wanted to ask questions, to speak, but fear kept her voice buried. This was not the man who ran simple errands, who smiled across candlelit dinners, who kissed her forehead in gentle affection. This was the force of a hurricane contained in human form, a man whose patience was infinite until it ran out, and now his patience had reached its terminus. The streetlights blurred as he drove, a rhythm of motion punctuated by the occasional glance at her in the rearview mirror. Her lips moved, forming a question, but it never reached his ears. He saw it in her eyes, the need for explanation, the attempt to understand, the silent plea for assurance that everything would be okay. He wanted to tell her, wanted to explain that no one would ever touch her again, that the world could crumble around them, and she would remain untouched in his presence. But explanations were useless. Action was the only language he understood, and the only language he knew his enemies would understand. The network of rivals had been hidden in the shadows for months. He had always known they existed, always known they were biding their time, waiting for a misstep. But no misstep could ever be permitted against his family, against his wife. Every plan, every operation he had conducted, every careful orchestration of control and influence, now funneled into a single objective: obliteration of anyone who dared threaten what was his. Names, faces, addresses, they flashed through his mind as he navigated the streets, memorizing the sequence of destruction that would leave his enemies begging for mercy. She kept her hands folded over the jacket, her fingers tracing the fabric, her body slowly unclenching as she realized she was still alive. Alive because of him. Safe, at least for the moment. But the adrenaline that had coursed through her moments before still left her body buzzing, her muscles tight, her mind racing. She had been humiliated, threatened, scared, and yet now she felt a strange mix of awe and terror, a recognition of power she had never fully comprehended until now. She didn't know if she could ever be angry at him for his violence, because she understood, in some deep, instinctual way, that this was protection. This was love manifested through control and fear, and it was absolute. He stopped briefly at an intersection, checking the perimeter with a glance that could have frozen fire. The car behind him hesitated, then fell back, recognizing the silent threat radiating from his presence. Even strangers felt it, the aura of inevitability, the scent of consequence for any wrong move. His mind was already calculating the next steps, where the thug had connections, where his backers were hiding, which warehouses were used as staging grounds, which streets were traps waiting for the unsuspecting. By the time he returned to his safe house, everyone in the district would know that the storm had come, and it would leave no stone unturned, no ally unscathed. When they arrived at the safe house, he moved with a fluidity that combined precision and dominance. She followed silently, sensing that she was not just being guided, but shielded. He opened the door and led her inside without a word, his eyes scanning every shadow, every corner, every possible threat. She realized that this was the calm before the hurricane, the brief moment of safety before he unleashed everything. The house was quiet, almost sterile in its order, but the energy in the air was thick, charged, ready to ignite. He didn't sit. He didn't even take off his jacket. Instead, he paced briefly, hands clasped behind his back, mind working through sequences, anticipating retaliation, planning the next strike. She wanted to speak, to ask him what would happen next, but words caught in her throat. She felt the weight of what had transpired in the diner. She had seen the fear in the thug's eyes, the cold precision of his husband, the threat that had made even the tattooed enforce her pause. And she realized that this man was not just a protector. He was a force of reckoning. Hours passed in silence. The city slept, but he did not. Maps, documents, and photographs littered the table in the center of the room. Lines connected names, locations, and potential threats. Every cell in the network of his enemies was identified, every weak point mapped with surgical precision. She watched from the corner, trembling slightly, overwhelmed by the scale of what was coming. She knew that once this started, there would be no turning back. The enemies would be erased, the streets would feel the consequences, and the man she loved would become untouchable, both as her protector and as a predator. By the time he finally turned toward her, night had deepened, and the city outside was oblivious to the storm about to descend. His expression softened only momentarily as he approached, cupping her face with the same tenderness he had shown in the diner. Her heart raced, torn between relief and fear. He kissed her again, slower this time, a promise of safety in a world about to be drenched in chaos. But she saw the shadow behind his eyes, the dark glint of anticipation, the hunger for retribution that burned hotter than fire. He whispered, not for her, not for anyone, but for the night itself to hear, the war had begun. And those who had dared humiliate, threaten, or touch his wife would not just pay. They would disappear. Every ally, every backer, every conspirator would fall like dominoes. There would be no mercy, no hesitation. This was the reckoning, the purge, and the absolute law of his domain. She wanted to step closer, to plead, to offer herself as an anchor against the storm, but he held her at arm's length. Not because he didn't love her, because he did more than anyone could understand, but because this was a battle that needed to be fought with clarity, precision, and fury. She realized that love in his world was inseparable from vengeance. Protection was inseparable from obliteration. Safety was inseparable from terror. He turned away, already moving toward the communication devices, already sending messages to his men, already setting the gears of destruction in motion. She watched, knowing that by sunrise, the city would tremble. By midnight, his enemies would regret ever existing. And by the time the first light touched the streets, he would have carved a path so meticulous, so brutal, and so complete that the name of the Mafia boss would be whispered with fear in every corner. Not for what he did before, but for what he would do tonight. Her fingers tightened around the jacket still draped over her shoulders. She realized, fully and irrevocably, that she was safe only as long as she remained within his orbit. Outside of it, there was chaos, there was danger, and there was death. She also realized that she had never truly understood the full force of his love, because love in his world was a weapon, precise, unstoppable, and absolute. And in that moment, she knew that the war was no longer just about the thug, no longer about humiliation. It was about survival, dominance, and the absolute power of a man who would kill everyone to protect what was his. The night stretched ahead, endless, charged, and merciless. And somewhere in the shadows, the enemies waited. They did not know yet that their time had expired. They did not know that the storm had arrived, already moving silently through the city, already touching lives with inevitable reckoning. They would learn soon enough. And when they did, there would be no escape. Because he did not forgive. He did not forget. And anyone who had touched her, anyone who had humiliated her, would not just fall. They would vanish. And she would watch, trembling but alive, as the world around them burned. The first strike came before dawn, silent as a shadow falling across the city. He moved like a ghost, unseen and untouchable, orchestrating chaos with the precision of a predator who had waited a lifetime for the moment to strike. His men, trained to move without question, without hesitation, executed orders that had been carved into their minds with ruthless clarity. Every target, every weak link, every hidden corner of the network was hit simultaneously. Explosions shattered the stillness. Gunfire ripped through the night, and the city trembled as if it could feel the weight of the storm that had been unleashed. She stayed inside the safe house, her hands clenched around the edge of the table, her body tight with tension, every nerve on fire. She could hear it, screams, the crunch of metal, the sharp metallic taste of violence in the air. And she knew, deep down, that it was all unfolding because of him, because of what had happened at the diner, because someone had dared to humiliate her, to underestimate the force that guarded her life. She wanted to look away, to hide, but every sound dragged her closer to the raw power of the man who loved her with a ferocity that was terrifying and beautiful at once. He moved through the city like a phantom of vengeance. He did not run. He did not panic. His steps were measured, precise, and each motion radiated control. A thug in an alley caught a glimpse of him and froze, realizing too late that the shadows had teeth, that every move he had ever made in the name of his bosses had led him straight into a trap he couldn't see until it was too late. One by one, they fell. No mercy, no hesitation, no second chances. His rage was a blade honed on betrayal, on humiliation, on the audacity of men who thought they could challenge him. The city outside roared in panic. Alarms screamed, cars skidded, people ran in confusion. And through it all, he was calm, calculating, unstoppable. His eyes scanned every movement, catching each sign of weakness, each flicker of fear. He struck with the precision of a surgeon, tearing through the network with a single-minded focus that left no one alive who could oppose him. He didn't even glance at the destruction as it unfolded. It was as if he was detached, a force of nature acting on instinct. Back in the safe house, she felt the tension of the world pressing in around her. She could not see him, could not touch him, could not intervene. And yet, she knew that no harm could come to her. Not now, not ever, because he was everywhere at once, a presence that could not be escaped. The thought of him moving through the city, leaving chaos in his wake, left her heart pounding, her stomach twisting in a mix of fear and awe. She had loved him before, but now she understood the full magnitude of what that love entailed. To be loved by him was to be untouchable, and yet to be tied to him was to live in the shadow of absolute violence. He returned hours later, not a single hair out of place, not a single breath rushed. The city had changed in the span of the night. Allies had vanished. Enemies lay broken or bleeding, and the message had been sent. He entered the safe house as if he had never left, calm, collected, a storm contained within the confines of man. She ran to him instinctively, relief and fear colliding in a single wave. But he held her at arm's length, eyes scanning, pulse steady, mind already 3 steps ahead. The aftermath was meticulous. Every name, every address, every connection that had dared threaten her or humiliate her was wiped from the board, replaced with empty space. His men moved with silent efficiency, cleaning up the remnants of the chaos he had unleashed, leaving only echoes and whispers in their wake. She watched, feeling the weight of the city's fear pressing against the walls of the safe house, knowing that her life had changed irreversibly. The man she loved was not just a protector. He was a predator, a force of reckoning that no one could survive. He finally approached her, slow, deliberate, and she felt the tension in her body begin to unravel under the weight of his presence. His hands, strong and sure, brushed her hair back from her face. His eyes, dark and unreadable, locked onto hers, and she understood without words that he had destroyed everything that threatened them. Every enemy, every challenge, every threat had been neutralized. And yet, beneath the calm, there was a pulse of hunger, a warning that the storm was not over, that the war had only begun. The adrenaline of the night still lingered in her veins, leaving her body tight, every muscle coiled. She clung to him instinctively, as if his very presence could shield her from the remnants of fear that still clung to her. And in that moment, she realized the full scale of what she had been a part of. Not by choice, not by accident, but because someone had dared to cross the line. She had survived the first wave, and she knew there would be more, because he was a man who did not stop at simple vengeance. He did not forgive. He did not forget. He would not rest until the world understood the price of daring to harm his wife. Plans were laid for the days ahead. Targets were marked, strategies refined, contingencies calculated. He moved with precision, a commander orchestrating. A battle that spanned streets, warehouses, and shadows. She could see the intensity in his eyes, the depth of his focus, and it terrified her. Every move he made was a promise, every action a message. Anyone who had wronged her, anyone who had underestimated him, would pay in ways too brutal to imagine. She stayed close, a silent witness to the scope of his control. She felt the pulse of his rage, the calculation of his mind, and the raw force of his presence. He didn't speak of what he would do next, but she knew. The city would feel it. His enemies would crumble. The people who had believed themselves untouchable would learn too late that the rules had changed. The man who had dared to humiliate her would not live to tell the tale, and those who had sent him would pay in full. Night after night, they moved. He never wavered, never slowed, never allowed hesitation to seep into his operations. She watched as he dismantled threats, one by one, each act a symphony of control and precision. She felt the weight of it in her chest, the terror and awe mingling into something unnameable. And yet, through it all, he returned to her, every time, calm and unbroken, offering the same reassurance, the same protection, the same silent promise that she was his, and that he would not stop until every threat was eliminated. The city began to bend beneath the force of his wrath. Enemies disappeared. Allegiances shattered. The network that had dared to humiliate her disintegrated under the precision of his attacks. And through it all, she remained by his side, trembling but alive, held within the orbit of a man whose love was absolute and whose fury was endless. When he finally paused, it was not because he had finished, but because he allowed himself a brief moment to look at her. His hands were steady, his eyes calm, but the storm within him had not abated. She felt it, the raw energy, the pulse of vengeance, the promise that there would be no mercy for those who had wronged her. And she understood, fully and irrevocably, that to love him was to live on the edge of chaos, to be shielded by a force more terrifying than anything the world could muster, and to exist in the shadow of a man who would destroy anyone who dared cross the line. He cupped her face, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, and she realized that even in the midst of war, even in the heart of destruction, there was tenderness. But it was tempered by the knowledge that tenderness could shift into obliteration in an instant. She felt her heartbeat slow, matched by his own, knowing that this calm was fleeting, a pause before the next wave of chaos, a brief respite in the unrelenting storm. He whispered a promise, low and quiet, that carried the weight of inevitability. The war was not over. The enemies were not all defeated. The storm had only begun, and anyone who had dared to humiliate his wife, to touch her, to threaten her, would feel the full force of a man who loved with unflinching intensity and destroyed without mercy. She shivered, caught between fear and awe, knowing that her life would never be the same, that she had entered a world where love was inseparable from violence, and protection was inseparable from terror. And she stayed there, trembling, watching him move through the room, calculating, planning, orchestrating the next strike, and realized that the world outside would never be the same again. He had made a choice, drawn a line in the sand, and anyone who crossed it would vanish. The first strike had been only the beginning, the initial ripple of chaos in a city that would soon bow to his will. She knew that when the sun rose, the city would burn in ways that could not be undone, and she would be there, trembling but alive, held in the orbit of a man whose rage was absolute, whose love was lethal, and whose vengeance had only just begun. The dawn came like a warning, sharp and unforgiving, cutting through the city as if it had been waiting for the reckoning. He was already in motion, every muscle coiled, every sense heightened, moving with the speed and precision of a man who had rehearsed the end of the world in his mind 1,000 times. There was no hesitation, no question, no pause. Every target, every connection, every shadow that had dared threaten his wife was a nail in a coffin he would personally hammer shut. She stayed close, almost instinctively, her body pressed against his as he moved through the first wave of chaos. Her mind was a storm of fear, awe, and adrenaline. She had never seen him like this before, and she was terrified that the raw force of his presence could consume her. But at the same time, she knew there was no place she could be safer than by his side. His eyes, dark and calculating, scanned every corner, every street, every potential threat. He was the storm incarnate, and she was caught inside its eye, trembling but shielded by a force more absolute than anything she had ever known. The first convoy was waiting, masked men in armored vehicles, their guns raised, their confidence unshakable, or so they thought. They had no idea that the storm they had challenged was not human in the conventional sense. They had no idea the man they were about to face was built on precision, rage, and an unflinching sense of ownership over the woman who now hid behind him. He moved forward, calculating, reading every movement, every twitch of muscle, every flicker of fear or hesitation. The first bullet flew, and it met its target before it even left the muzzle. Chaos erupted instantly. Tires screamed, glass shattered, men screamed, bodies fell. He moved through the convoy like a shadow cutting flesh, not flinching, not slowing, his focus absolute. Every thug that tried to reach for a weapon found themselves smashed, thrown, or dismantled before they could even react. Vehicles flipped, engines exploded, the air filled with the metallic tang of destruction and the screams of the unprepared. And through it all, he moved with an almost terrifying calm, eyes locked forward, mind running 1,000 moves ahead, calculating every possible outcome with ruthless clarity. She watched, trembling, her hands gripping the edge of the car as it maneuvered through the chaos. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of terror and awe that left her breathless. She realized fully now that to be with him was to live inside a world that was at once terrifying and magnetic. Every man who had touched her, who had humiliated her, who had dared to think they could threaten her safety, was being obliterated. And she understood, without words, that there would be no mercy, no hesitation, no reprieve. He moved from target to target with surgical precision. Enemies tried to retreat, tried to find cover, tried to regroup, but every attempt was anticipated and neutralized. Bodies fell, screams echoed, vehicles burned. The city itself seemed to shiver under the weight of his wrath, bending to the will of a man who had been pushed beyond restraint. And through it all, she remained close, silent, gripping the jacket around her shoulders, feeling the pulse of his power radiate through her body. Hours passed in relentless motion. Every alley, every building, every supposed safe house for his enemies became a trap, a tomb, a testament to the price of challenging him. His men moved like extensions of his will, but it was clear that even their precision was secondary to the force that emanated from him. He did not shout orders. He did not hesitate. He did not falter. He was the apex of the storm, the harbinger of obliteration, and every living thing in his path felt it, whether they realized it or not. She tried to speak once, her voice cracking under the weight of adrenaline and awe, but he silenced her with a look that carried the full weight of authority. Not anger, not threat, but a quiet certainty that she needed only to exist within his protection. She felt it in her bones, the understanding that her survival, her safety, depended entirely on his ability to remain the unstoppable force he had become. And she realized, fully, that she had never known the extent of his love, because love in his world was inseparable from destruction, from control, from the absolute imposition of will over the lives of anyone who threatened what was his. The second wave hit in the late afternoon. The network had thought they could regroup, hide, bargain, or bribe their way out. They had underestimated him. Every warehouse, every safe house, every hidden enclave was systematically dismantled. Explosions tore through walls, flames licked at structures, and the screams of men who had been too confident, too arrogant, too blind to fear filled the air. And through it all, he moved like a shadow, precise, untouchable, calm, lethal. She followed him, trembling, almost unable to breathe, feeling the electric terror of his presence in every step. She had never seen a man who could love so completely and destroy so completely at the same time. And she knew now that he would not stop. Not until every single threat had been eliminated, not until the city itself understood the cost of daring to humiliate, to touch, to challenge the woman he loved. The adrenaline left her body taut, her senses sharpened, her mind racing to comprehend the scale of what she was witnessing. By nightfall, the city was in chaos. Fires burned in abandoned buildings. Vehicles were overturned, the streets empty except for the remnants of those who had dared oppose him. His men moved through the shadows, carrying out orders that required no explanation. And he moved with them, a single-minded force of destruction, his mind already planning the next strike, already calculating the next set of targets. The network that had dared touch her was in shambles, their allies fleeing, their power broken, their arrogance erased. She finally allowed herself to breathe when they returned to the safe house, but the tension did not leave her. She watched him move through the room, methodical, precise, eyes scanning, mind calculating. She understood now that this war was not over. The first strike had been only the beginning, the second only the escalation. He would not rest. He would not pause. He would not stop. The storm had been unleashed, and it would continue until every last thread of opposition had been obliterated. He approached her finally, slow, deliberate, and the calm that surrounded him was almost unbearable. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, to beg for mercy on behalf of those who would soon face it, but she could not. Words would be meaningless. She understood fully now that action was the only language he knew, and destruction was the only response to transgression. His hands brushed her hair from her face, his eyes locked on hers, and she felt the weight of his power, the absolute certainty that she was safe because he had made the world around them lethal for anyone who dared touch her. Plans were already in motion for the next day. Targets had been identified, contingencies set, networks mapped. He moved through the room with a predator's grace, his mind working faster than any enemy could react. She felt the pulse of the city under his influence, the terror radiating from every corner, the knowledge that his vengeance would not allow even a single thread of opposition to survive. And she realized fully that she had entered a world where love and destruction were inseparable, where protection required obliteration, where survival depended entirely on the man she loved. By midnight, she finally allowed herself to rest, trembling but alive, held in the orbit of a man whose rage was absolute and whose love was lethal. She understood now that the storm had only begun, that the war would continue, that the city would bow to his will or burn entirely. And she stayed close, her body pressed to his, feeling the full weight of what it meant to be loved by a man who would destroy everything for her safety, a man who could cradle her and crush her enemies in the same breath, a man whose tenderness was inseparable from his terror. The night stretched ahead, endless, merciless, and charged with the anticipation of more chaos. And she stayed there, trembling, knowing that she would witness every act of retribution, every strike of vengeance, every obliteration, and she would survive because he had made her untouchable. And she realized fully, with a mix of awe and terror, that to love him was to live at the edge of a storm that would never end, a storm that burned, tore, and obliterated anyone who dared oppose it. And she knew, beyond fear and awe, that she would never be alone, never be threatened again, and that the world had changed because of him, because of the force he had unleashed, and because of the absolute law he had imposed in the name of love, vengeance, and ownership. By dawn, the city was already trembling under the weight of his wrath. He had tracked the remaining players to a fortified compound on the outskirts, a place they thought was impenetrable, a place that would keep them safe from the storm. But he had calculated every entry point, memorized every shadow, anticipated every weakness. This was not just a strike. It was the culmination of every slight, every humiliation, every threat to the woman he loved. She watched from the car, hands pressed against the leather seat, heart pounding, every nerve screaming. He moved like a predator, eyes scanning, body coiled, his presence radiating a danger that could consume entire streets. His men fanned out silently, clearing the perimeter, while he advanced alone, because some acts required the hand of the storm itself. She wanted to reach for him, to touch him, to stop him, but she knew there was no stopping him. Not now, not ever. The gates fell in moments, security overwhelmed before they even realized the storm had arrived. He moved through the compound like a ghost, silent, lethal, unstoppable. Each man who had dared to plot against his wife was incapacitated, thrown, or eliminated with precise efficiency. They tried to flee, tried to negotiate, but there was no bargaining with the force he had become. Every action he took was a lesson, every strike a message. Humiliation, threat, betrayal, all met with absolute and irreversible consequence. She followed at a distance, her pulse racing, her body trembling from the tension and fear and awe of witnessing the storm in its full fury. Every time he paused, it was to assess, to calculate, to ensure that no one escaped the reckoning. Every target was accounted for, every ally neutralized, every leader crushed. By the time he was done, the compound was in ruins, the network annihilated, their power extinguished. He finally turned, his eyes finding hers across the chaos. And in that moment, the storm shifted. The rage in him remained, but there was relief, there was triumph. There was the unspoken communication that justice had been served. She ran to him, trembling, and he caught her, holding her close, letting her feel the pulse of his heart, steady now, still fierce, but no longer driven by immediate vengeance. She clung to him, sobbing, the tension of fear and adrenaline giving way to relief, awe, and a deep, consuming love. The enemies lay vanquished, their arrogance destroyed, their network in shambles. Every thug, every conspirator, every man who had dared touch her or challenge him had felt the full force of his wrath. And yet, he did not gloat. He did not revel in destruction. He simply ensured that justice had been served, that the wrongs against her had been corrected in a way that could never be undone. His control, his power, and his love for her had guaranteed survival and dominance. And that was the only result that mattered. She looked up at him, tears running down her face, realizing fully the depth of what she had been a part of, the magnitude of the force that protected her, and the price of daring to challenge the man who loved her. She had seen him cradle her gently and destroy entire networks in the same breath, and she understood the duality of his power, the tenderness for her, the terror for his enemies. She realized that love in his world was inseparable from absolute authority and protection. Hours later, they returned to the safe house. He was quiet, composed, still dangerous, still lethal, but the immediate storm had passed. She clung to him, her body shaking, not from fear now, but from the emotional release of surviving the unrelenting violence, witnessing the absolute force of a man who would annihilate anyone who dared harm her. And in that moment, she knew the full extent of his love, relentless, absolute, and impossibly fierce. He held her, brushing hair from her face, whispering assurances she didn't even need to hear. His calm was a balm after the chaos, his presence a shield after the storm. She realized that she had survived not just the physical threat, but the emotional terror of facing the world with someone so untouchable, so absolute in his protection, that nothing and no one could threaten her again. She felt his heartbeat against hers, steady and strong, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to exhale, to relax, to simply exist within the orbit of the man who had destroyed everything that dared touch her. The consequences had been severe. The enemies who had dared humiliate her, touch her, or threaten her were gone, their power obliterated, their alliances shattered. His message had been sent loud and clear. No one would challenge him and live to tell the tale. No one would harm his wife without paying a price beyond comprehension. The city itself seemed to recoil under the weight of the storm, knowing that the law of the Mafia boss had been reinforced, strengthened, and rendered unbreakable. And yet, in the midst of the chaos and devastation, there was the quiet, tender connection between them. The kiss he pressed to her forehead was soft, deliberate, a reminder that love still existed in the eye of the storm. She pressed against him, the weight of fear, adrenaline, awe, and relief all colliding in a single, overwhelming wave. She realized fully, in that intimate moment, that love could exist in the most violent of worlds, that protection could coexist with obliteration, and that survival was possible when someone loved you with an absolute, unflinching force. She finally whispered his name, and though words were not necessary, it was a recognition of the bond forged through chaos, the understanding that they had survived together, stronger for it. He held her close, letting the tremors of her body calm, letting the storm inside her chest settle. And in that embrace, there was the emotional payoff, the catharsis after relentless fury, the acknowledgement that the world was dangerous, but love, protection, and vengeance could coexist perfectly within one man. The night stretched on, calm now, almost unreal in contrast to the violent chaos that had preceded it. Justice had been served. Consequences had been exacted. The enemies had been obliterated. And the woman, once humiliated and terrified, now understood the full magnitude of the man who loved her, protected her, and destroyed everything that dared threaten her. She stayed by his side, hands pressed to his chest, heart still racing, knowing that nothing in the city could ever harm her again. And he remained calm, composed, lethal, the storm that had swept through the lives of those who dared oppose him now contained, for the moment, in a quiet intensity that promised vigilance, protection, and love beyond measure. The storm has passed, but the mark of justice remains. Love and vengeance can coexist in the most extreme ways, and those who threaten it will face consequences they cannot survive. Protect what you love with unwavering force, and never underestimate the ones who guard their hearts. Subscribe for more stories that hit harder than reality. Comment with your thoughts, share this with friends, and stay ready for the next adrenaline-fueled saga.